All right. Good evening, everybody. How are we tonight? Everybody hear me? Am I speaking English? No? Oh, no English? No English being spoken? So, it has been a hell of a news week, hasn't it? Donald Trump got invited to an anti-Semitism conference and thought it was an invitation. I don't understand how he's capable of functioning. Like, we had 3 weeks of news stories about how Biden wasn't able to be a candidate, and Donald Trump just says wild ass shit, and here we are, not a peep out of the media. It turns out that someone had the incredible poor taste to decide to sleep with RFK Jr., a reporter no less. And look, it's cool, do what you do consensually, but maybe not the guy who keeps trying to kill all the Americans by getting rid of vaccines. Just a thought. And of course, Israel decided to set a new land speed record and design their own personal crime against humanity, which is what we're mostly going to talk about tonight. I sat on this for a little bit and I tried to read what information came out because, to be perfectly honest, this is an unprecedented attack. And there's nothing really comparable to this on any kind of scale. So, over the course of this week, Wednesday and Thursday, you had Israel engage in the remote detonation of pagers, walkie talkies, and solar panels systems in this country of Lebanon. Ostensibly, these objects were distributed to them from uh, distributed by Israel to Hezbollah, which is a political party and militant group in Lebanon that is founded primarily in opposition to Israel's incursions into Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War in the 1980s. There are problems with that on the whole of it, but Israel proceeds to detonate several thousand pagers being used as a communication device by uh, ostensibly members of Hezbollah. And then the next day proceeds to detonate two-way radios and being in use by members of Hezbollah, ostensibly, and then solar panels. This naturally decided to reignite the debate about war crimes. And I knew instinctively that it was definitely a no go situation. Like what they had done was beyond the pale. Israel had done. Um, the problem is that like five different things crossed through my mind at once. So obviously, there's this article here that Sunday had a long discussion about yesterday, pertaining to booby traps and minefields, and that's a good place to start, I think, because but it doesn't quite capture what's happened here, right? So the booby trap provisions of this particular article, amended in '93 for the Geneva Conventions and IHL, imagines a situation in which a soldier takes a booby trap and physically places it in a certain spot and then leaves it there. Um, it doesn't imagine the concept of thousands of mail bombs being mailed out and sent to an enemy force. And like we would recognize, for example, that it would be inappropriate in a war crime if we were to take a bunch of mail bombs and mail them out to a military base and the houses around that military base in order to attempt to maim soldiers who got their mail in as a broad, like, broad perspective. Like, we would recognize that as a war crime. The arguments that I have seen have been kind of buck wild. This isn't quite the same thing as booby trapping because, like I said, the concept of booby trapping involves taking the booby trap and placing it, not shipping the booby trap out and having it distributed. So, like, on a surface level, you could try to wriggle out of it that way. Is it a bombing? Not necessarily in the sense that it's an airborne bombing, but it is, like, they made the pagers explode. They made the walkie-talkies explode. They made the solar panels explode. So it's a bombing in that sense, but not in the traditional sense. And on it goes. It's like Israel decided to invent themselves a whole new class of crime against humanity, which, kudos, I guess, if that's the thing you're into. It's not really great. So let's kind of get into this. What is Hezbollah first? Because establishing that is important. Like, as I mentioned, Hezbollah has a number of different functions within Lebanese society. They're a political party. They're not a very big one. I think they only hold like 15 seats. Parliament. And Hezbollah has a militant wing, and this militant wing is primarily concerned with engaging the IDF, keeping them out of southern Lebanon, that sort of thing. They attack Israel fairly regularly. They attack Israel in an illegal fashion. Let's get that out of the way right off the bat. They fire rockets indiscriminately into Israeli cities. And it's not good. But as I keep trying to say again and again and again, it does not matter that someone has committed a crime. That doesn't abrogate your responsibility to protect their rights. They are entitled to certain treatment. We recognize this as a fundamental concept of law enforcement, even if it's not necessarily rigorously obeyed. This is the way. This is how it's done. And Israel routinely ignores this. Hezbollah has other functions in Lebanese society. They have medical functions. They have doctors. They have nurses, EMTs. They have teachers. They have schools. All of which, the mere fact of being a member of Hezbollah and performing that duty does not make you a valid combatant. The combatants of Hezbollah are combatants. The medical personnel are protected persons. So I can't just send out pagers indiscriminately, pager bombs indiscriminately, and say this is a targeted attack. The reality is, it's not. Because I don't know to whom Hezbollah is going to be distributing those pagers. I don't know where those solar panels are going. I don't know who has that walkie-talkie. And even if they all were distributed to combatants, I don't know who's holding them at the time they're detonating. At the end of it all, what you have done is sent out a bunch of bombs into a civilian population, into an area in which people are ostensibly existing and doing things that have nothing to do with combating Israel. And then you detonated bombs. You disrupted their lives. You caused a terrorist attack, to be frank. And we know just from what we know already that the casualty count included children, included aid workers, included medical workers, included those people who are supposed to be able to help unimpeded by being attacked. We know this. That there were children in funerals. We don't really know the full extent of the casualties because, as it happens, they took out their communication network. So much of the arguments I have seen have centered primarily around this provision, these sections of the prohibition against booby traps and landmines. And I want to talk about this for a little bit. Let's zoom in a little. Boop, 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 boop. I had us laid point 2. Point 2 is pretty definitive, by the way. It is prohibited to use booby traps or other devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects, which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material. The exact details of how Israel did this are not yet apparent. But from the footage I have seen of individuals who were subject to this at the time, Israel employed explosive devices inside the pagers. This is functionally the end of the discussion in my mind. But it's worth talking about the next part, because a considerable amount of angst has been expended on this. And it's let's get into it. Without prejudice to the provisions of Article 3, it is prohibited to use weapons to which this article applies in any city, town, village, or other area containing a similar concentration of civilians in which combat between ground forces is not taking place or does not appear to be imminent, unless either. So this is establishing that if you booby trap an area and leave it, and you are no longer engaged in holding that location, you have committed a crime. If you are not going to be entering that city and engaged in combat, you have committed a crime. This does not create an exception to this above here, right? It simply establishes a set of circumstances in which a booby trap could be, and this is very important, could be efficacious. The exception that we are talking about in particular, and I've seen some arguing about, is they are placed on or in close vicinity of a military objective. So to clear this up, the elimination of enemy combatant personnel may be a military objective. However, the act that Israel engaged in does not qualify for this. Israel didn't place these anywhere. Israel gave them, intercepted a shipment intended for another place, modified that shipment with explosives, and then sent that shipment off to that organization who was unaware that they had booby-trapped items on them. Israel does not know with whom they have been placed. They have no accountability for one of the most basic distinctions that you have to make in wartime, which is the difference between a valid combatant and a protected person. There are members of Hezbollah who qualify as protected persons. Because again, the mere fact that one is a member of Hezbollah, their political wing, or their civil services, does not make you a target. In the exact same way that members of Hamas who were police or members of Hamas working for the health ministry in Gaza were not valid targets. The exact same way that members of Hamas's political wing are not valid targets. To try to argue that the mere existence of being a member of Hezbollah as a military objective is so beyond the pale to me, and I'll be frank, the person I saw doing it most recently was Wick, who again doesn't know anything and likes to repeat shit he thinks it makes him look smart, is so beyond the pale to me that I can't fathom why people don't like us. It's frankly horrifying. The other thing I note is this is not necessarily, this whole document is not necessarily envisioning a concept of this kind of hybridization of this attack. So, like, obviously the pagers and the radios and the solar panels are booby traps, but they were also set off through a cyber attack. And that's a thing unto itself that's a kind of a problem. The existence of these things is different than it used to be, right? Pagers weren't always a big thing. Cell phones weren't always a big thing. Now, cell phones are ubiquitous throughout much of the world. Pagers, same. Less so, but still the same. Still very heavily in use by people who are protected persons, medical personnel, for example. It's not attacks on the regular everyday things are what tend to scare people. Not that I want to draw a direct comparison between 9/11, but we have a model that we kind of understand uh, what happens and how people feel, and like the terror that's caused when attacks are made upon the regular everyday thing. 9/11, you had 4 planes hijacked, 3 crashed into major buildings, the World Trade Center, principal towers, Pentagon, and that fourth plane whose passengers heroically downed the plane to prevent it from probably attacking the White House. Over that time, and as that situation emerged, you can look at the maps of the flights of that day and how the thousands of flights that run domestically all over the United States every day just stopped. This is the same thing. Imagine a situation in which a country induces your cell phone as a method of attack. Israel just declared to the world that this is valid, that this is a thing that bad actors can do. And it will happen again, probably to somewhere here in the United States or in Israel. And when it does, it'll be called a terrorist attack. It'll be called monstrous. It will be called all of these things. And the perpetrators, whether assumed or known, will be vilified. Rightly so. But now we need to establish that this should be off limits. There were options. If Israel's objective was the destruction of Hezbollah, the communications network, there were options to brick those pagers and walkie-talkies that didn't involve turning them into explosive devices. Everyone's headphones fail. They can be induced to fail through manufacturing defects. There were options available. They didn't have to do this way. But they chose to. They chose to make people afraid. They chose to harm kids. They chose to harm civilians. And I hope, I don't want to have us live in a world where we have destroyed that distinction on behalf of, frankly, terrible people. That distinction of protected person and that going about their day and living their lives versus the combatant. I really hope that's not how this works. Because that's not a world, particularly as we become more connected to one another, that's not a world that's safe for anyone, let alone Jews or Arabs or anyone. This should scare people. You should be afraid of this. Particularly when you take account this smartphones we have today are a hell of a lot harder to get into for the average owner than the ones we started out with like 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Like, it's hard to inspect your shit. Taking apart a laptop, it's tricky. You can do it, no doubt about it. But it's hard, and there's a good chance you're going to screw it up putting it back together. This should scare people. We should be afraid of this. Israel has unleashed a horrific concept onto the world, and that's going to be copied. And I think they should be appropriately chastised for it. Punished is a good place to start. With that, President Sunday had a discussion with Lonerbox about this, which I will review for your viewing pleasure. So let's get started on that, and we'll take a hydration break. Short order.
Got my Discord up if you want to call Sunday. Sounds like we agree on one or two things. Oh my god. Probably on less than you hope, but let's see.
That's a good reaction to when Lonerbox decides to start talking.
So, do you want to do the objectives thing, or have you solved that?
I'm not actually terribly interested in that. I would rather raise something else if you're fine with that. Yep. Pertaining to this, there's been a lot of heat with Little Light about this whole thing. So I'm gonna try to be anti-Tyler for a few minutes.
Try your best.
The primary issue I have with all of this, I find this topic incredibly wearying and depressing, and it sucks the life out of me to do it. So no, without a doubt, like, you spent the last year or so, Steven spent the last year or so doing absolutely nothing but just assembling trivia about this, like a lot. I'm not gonna like dismiss that or disparage the nature of the research or whatever it is. That's not really my issue. My issue here is that a lot of this is ambiguous about how this will be interpreted by international courts, by human rights people, et cetera, and the details are not fully known. And one of the major issues I have with how this has been handled by people in your milieu is that the attitude has been to provide pushback against criticism in advance of the people who are using these forms of attack being held to any account whatsoever. And I find that extraordinarily dangerous because it helps to neuter the kind of accountability that we actually need people to be generally reflexively demanding of people who are using things like, for example, pager bombs in civilian centers or missiles on houses and things of that sort.
Okay. I don't know if you were listening to the call before Tyler came in.
I wasn't.
Okay, so there was a Lebanese guy who came on to talk to me. Like, his actual family is in the south. And I think we were talking about how his mom was in a car, and a guy in front of her, his pager blew up,
right,
or his walkie-talkie, and the car skidded away, and she had to like turn to avoid it. And I was like, I think one of the best objections I've heard so far is that it's not. I think they had a reasonable belief. They had good reasons to think that the pagers would be almost all in the hands of soldiers. I think there's enough evidence for that so far.
I think there's absolutely no evidence that says that so far, but okay, you do you, son.
But I don't think they were in a position to know where exactly everyone was, meaning not just the explosions in shops, but the like people in...
That's the whole ball game. That's it. You did not have an ability to make a distinction between soldiers and civilians. You launched an illegal attack. That's the ball game. We're 2 minutes in. Well done, everybody. We could go home now.
Cars with their pager goes off, or if they're even in a munitions area.
No. I understand. I understand all of that. What is the basis for thinking that these would only end up in the hands of soldiers? Do you have a particular document?
Mostly, the IRGC, 2 of them were interviewed by the New York Times, and they said that these particular pagers from that Hungarian company were for distribution for Hezbollah.
Well, for Hezbollah.
That's not sufficient to argue that that's soldiers. Again, like I pointed out earlier, Hezbollah is an organization that contains a political wing and civil services and emergency services. You can't merely argue from that position.
But for example, like they determined that Hezbollah would not be distributing these to civilian parts of their personnel, or for example, to like maybe more broader use, like they could end up in the hands of medical personnel or whatever. Like how was this determined? Because that's what you need to know, right? You need to know that.
Yeah, I can use. So it might be that, but then I guess I don't have the exact information on that. But there are 2 reasons I could infer it. Is the
Can I stop you right there?
Or
you can't infer, like, this isn't a thing where you make inferences. This is a thing where you use actionable intelligence to make a decision. Using inferences isn't acceptable. You are like, not how this works.
Can I stop you right there? Okay. Given the fact that one party has already used these weapons, and given the fact that there are particular stipulations for how they are legally and ethically permitted to use these weapons, why wouldn't you just let them provide the proof that they did it properly? Why would you give them the benefit of the doubt and try to search for ways in which it might be the case?
Oh, no, it's just I'm saying with the information we have now, because the 2 guards, the way that they're quoted here, or the way that they're referenced, is that they say the members and operatives, they were used only by Hezbollah members and operatives, not widely distributed among ordinary citizens. So they mention citizens, but I guess the more reasonable assumption is that the reason that they switched over to pagers was because they didn't want their military operations to get disturbed by Israel intercepting them. Whereas I'm not sure
Well, there's no reason to assume that Israel wouldn't be intercepting their civil operations. We've watched Israel spend the last 11 months bombing aid workers, doctors, reporters. There's no reason to assume that if you are in the general path of Israel, that they will show any distinction for whether or not you are a protected person. You can't make that assumption. We have a documented history of crimes against humanity being committed by the IDF in Gaza extensively over the past 11 months. We have a documented history going back decades for the same. Lebanon, the whole reason that Hezbollah exists is because Israel came and committed atrocities in Lebanon.
Rational reason for like
I understand that they didn't want their phones monitored, but did they explain how they actually determined that it would only be Hezbollah combatants that would receive these pagers? Did they give a methodology?
No, they
for
haven't
that?
Explained that. No, and if it turned out that they had actually been okay with like.
So if I may, why is that not like the tenets of your analysis here? So they say they did. Okay, have they shown us this? No. All right. Well, now we need to know how you knew this. Why would we even be like speculating about how they might have known when they haven't told us? Surely, given that they're liable for this, they tell us if they did.
Yeah, because 90%. Well, whenever I've been talking about this so far, when it's not Tyler screaming at me, I've been saying with the evidence that we have so far, and I've mentioned this like every single time I've spoken about this so far. Right.
Yeah, but the evidence we have so far has suggested none of that whatsoever. There has been no evidence that Israel engaged in any distinction between protected persons and civilians in this attack.
Well, with the evidence that we've got so far, but I'm not just talking about like what you are licensed to speculate about. What I'm saying is that given that we are talking about this in front of other people, given that those other people are going to take the tone or the vibe of how this is spoken about to determine how they think about this to a certain extent, or it's going to give them a general sort of, a lot of people look up to you and pay attention to what you say, including people with a lot of influence, not like world-changing influence, but not insignificant either. Given that that's the case, why would we want to even open the door to, well, there's quite possibly a number of reasons that would perfectly justify this. Why not leave the tension there, specifically so that in the event that there isn't, in the event they don't know, as many people as you have any connection to are holding their feet to the fire to make sure that they provide that justification.
I'm not sure what you mean by that, because I'm just saying that we're going with the information that we have now and what seems the most likely, and that it's very subject to change. But I don't think I've ever shied away from saying that, like, for example, I was talking about like Hasbro on Twitter or whatever, basically calling this like the most amazing precise strike ever and all this, and like, or like making ball jokes. Like, I'm not for that and I haven't done that. So,
well, I'm not saying you did, but
because the inverse is possible as well, right? It could actually be that this was the best possible way to achieve a legitimate objective, right? Like, it's not just Israelis.
Well, no, if you're going to speculate that this is the best possible way to achieve a legitimate objective, then you have to say what that legitimate objective is, and then we can make a judgment about whether or not it is the best possible way to do it. You can, by and large, okay, let's sidebar. 90% of how this information coming out of conflict zones is evaluated is through open source information. This is by and large media reports that are coming out of conflict zones. You can't turn around and argue that there is a veil in information, and then say, well, it might be good, particularly when the entire case depends upon those specifics that are pretty easy to figure out. Like, you can see the effects of the strike. You could see the child being buried after they were killed by this exploding pager. You can see these things, and then you can make reasonable assumptions. There's not going to be a time for which you can hold judgment and suddenly come up with a better one. Because guess what? The details of this are classified and won't be declassified for decades. The information we have now is insufficient to make the argument that this is a legal attack. Therefore, we must reasonably assume that this is an illegal attack because it looks like an illegal attack.
Also, who get to, who have that, like.
Well, did we have that?
But it's also Syrians as well, right? Because a lot of people, Hezbollah guys in Syria got hit. So
has the objective been stated in such a way that is made clear that this is the best possible way to achieve an objective? And is that objective necessary? Like, is that an objective that is justified by its own urgency? So or rather, put it another way, does the urgency of the objective justify the means taken to attain it? With the information we have now, I think it does, because the way of Hezbollah fights, there's not really, if the ratio of injuries is anything like the ratio of deaths, then you're going to have to, I apologize, you're going to have to,
precise way.
I didn't understand what you said. Can you restate that?
If the ratio of injuries is about the same as the ratio of deaths, then this is the most effective way that you could target Hezbollah with the minimum collateral damage because of how they fight. And I think
so. The only way you can target Hezbollah is by bombing them with booby-trapped pagers. Hezbollah has existed since 1982. They have fought numerous battles with Israelis. Did this attack destroy Hezbollah? That's now where we're at, because that's what Lonerbox is saying. Did this attack destroy Hezbollah? No, they're still fucking tweeting. Hezbollah is still an operational organization. They probably got 1,000 new recruits for every pager bomb. I don't. What? Did this operationally degrade Hezbollah? They launched 150 rockets into Israel today. Did this operational, like, that's after the pager bombs, the walkie-talkie bombs, the solar panel bombs, and actual fighter jets bombing them. And Hezbollah is still capable of launching offensive operations. So all you did was blow up the pagers.
I think given Hezbollah's actions, either in Syria or in Lebanon, and Syria or Israel, Lebanon as well a bit, then I think that makes sense to do because they're aggressors in this case.
Well, I mean, let's.
Are they? Who is the aggressor in this entire conflict is not, like, it didn't start on October 7th, and that doesn't make Hamas necessarily the aggressor. Like this isn't not connected. This is pretty complex. I think you can't take this as a single incident of, oh, they're the aggressors. It's not really a good analysis of the situation.
Just take that for granted that is the case, that would actually be the most humane way to attack Hezbollah given how they fight. Be that as it may, did the particular military objective in this case necessitate that particular action? Because there is, for example, you can have a military objective that...
Sunday is hitting all the right points here. Fundamentally hitting all the right points. He doesn't necessarily have the knowledge base to close the gap, but he's fundamentally hitting all the right spots.
That isn't essential, but it's still a military objective, in which case you've killed a whole bunch of people needlessly because you did a thing that you didn't actually need to do, even if that was the best way to do it, assuming you're doing it. Right?
Yeah, if they did it for a laugh, because people getting maimed makes them happy, then
or what about
it's even like a propaganda win or a humiliation thing or a psychological thing. Like, obviously these were all factors, but if that was the only reason they did it, then yeah, it's stupid.
Well, what if it's a collection of psychological factors and a general weakening of morale and capacity? Like, what if it's something more general than that? You would be able to more or less include... There'd be basically no situations under which this kind of attack wouldn't be prohibited.
If they did it to weaken Hezbollah's communications, as well as all the other things about like psychologically weakening them and everything.
Well, no, again, to point out what I said before, if you want to do that, there are better ways. More to the point, if I am capable of intercepting and infiltrating Hezbollah on such a level that I can get a whole slew of their fucking pagers and get put whatever the fuck I want inside them, why don't I just add a chip that tells me exactly what the pager's transmitting information is? How is that not immensely more valuable to me? Every time the pager goes off, I intercept it. I can build an entire database of Hezbollah's communication information. And when I do want to head into Lebanon as an Israeli in this hypothetical, now I have a very good idea of what the normal pattern of communications is between Hezbollah on this supposedly uncrackable network. And to top it off, I now can see the differences in those communications, which helps me to, in fact, more precisely engage Hezbollah fighters when I can detect, for example, you mobilize a number of fighters in this area to combat this Israeli incursion. Like, there are much more militarily valuable things I can do by this near total infiltration of Hezbollah's communications. This kind of gets into the Barack Obama drone strike thing. Barack Obama rather famously increases the number of drone strikes that the United States engages in on suspected terrorists. And this obviously infuriates leftists because they don't like drones, but and the concept of people getting murdered. But broadly speaking, the intelligence community wasn't terribly happy with this. They would have much rather engaged in operations on the ground in which you sent in somebody, captured the person, and interrogated them for their information. Killing people, maiming them, wounding them, generally does not have the same value on the whole as infiltrating and getting information from them. It has a much more concrete military value than it does simply exploding 4,000 pagers, which at this point basically looks like it was for a laugh.
Well, if they wanted to weaken their communications, couldn't they just...
for them to...
Well, if they wanted to weaken their communications, if that was indeed the goal, couldn't they just sabotage their equipment? Why do they have to bomb them in civilian centers?
because the militants are still militants. They're still people who can do operations and fire rockets. And
Right,
like
but
So
what you're pointing out though is that what you're
potentially
pointing out,
yeah. Okay. Fundamentally, though, that doesn't answer Sunday's question. The militants can still fire rockets, but they still fired rockets today into Israel. You didn't stop that with the pager bombs. So, same question. You're still at the same point. Why couldn't you just brick the thing or infiltrate the thing?
1,000 or 2,000 people.
yeah, sure, but what you're pointing out though is that the point, obviously, the objective is not actually to cripple their communications. That's a bonus.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean that doesn't help, because we're still now left with the question of why were you bombing pagers and radios in civilian centers?
Oh, it's because, well, I imagine it's also to incapacitate soldiers, because now there's like potentially 2,000 or 3,000 people.
But I mean, so what it broadly.
Okay. Hang on. Let me parse that sentence. We're bombing civilian centers to incapacitate soldiers. There are two possible ways this goes. We are still trying to argue that all the pagers are in the hands of combatants. Objectively false. Even at this juncture that this was occurring at. Secondly, Lernerbox is arguing that the incapacitation of civilians will cause soldiers to not be able to fight because they'll have to care for them. As if you're a sniper setting up a salt lick where you wound a guy, and then when someone comes out to help that guy, you shoot that guy. You know what that's called? That's called a war crime, buddy. Same principle as if I launch an attack on a site, a bombing attack, and then emergency services and all that shit arrives. Then I launch a second attack to attack that. War crime. Fundamentally incapable of understanding this, Lonerbox seems to be.
Broadly means then is that what you're actually talking about is it was meant to disadvantage Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, but you can do virtually anything to disadvantage. Like, once again, you were left in a situation where there's literally no situation under which this kind of attack would be prohibited. Kind of makes the whole conversation moot.
There's no situation where it could be. Oh, no, there are. There could be. So with collateral, even though it's just an assumption now based on the death ratio, because we don't have the injury ratio. But based on the death ratio, it seems to be that it was fairly discerned. Like the
as opposed to what? Like, we have thousands of civilians hurt because they.
You just admitted that you don't have the information from which to make that distinction. You don't know who was injured and in what. Excuse me, and in what quantity. All right, let's take that break. I'll be right back. All right. Welcome back. Let's make sure all this is working properly. Excellent.
They exploded in civilian centers.
No, you're assuming that that there were thousands of civilians hurt. It could have been thousands of Hezbollah who were. We don't know the ratio of injured. That's why I mean the ratio of deaths is the only number.
Well, do we have a special reason to think that the majority of the people injured are Hezbollah? Let's say half.
Well, the majority of deaths were Hezbollah.
Majority of deaths, but there are thousands of injured. Far fewer dead.
Yeah, because look at those explosions are not that big. They'd mostly injure people.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, but why is it acceptable? Why is it acceptable to injure that many civilians? And by the way, it's
we don't know how many civilians are injured. We don't know. It could be but
you're not
half of them. It could be 70%. It could be 80%.
You're not seriously going to contend that those 2,000 people were the majority Hezbollah operatives.
Why not?
Yeah, you have absolutely no reason to, though. You have no way of knowing because the distribution of the attack is such that you do not know.
Well, I'm asking you why so. The reason why I'm asking you why so is because my position puts the onus on Israel to actually justify the attack, which means they're held accountable. Yours gives...
Which is exactly how it's supposed to work. Israel is responsible for its actions.
Them a way out. It makes people sort of soften their touch when it comes to them.
Why would most of the deaths be Hezbollah, but most of the injuries are civilians?
Well,
you don't know how that's going to shake out, though. There's no logical leap to assume that all these people were in Hezbollah who died. It's also who's reported who has died, not necessarily the full death toll. There's no reason to assume that.
Well, because the Hezbollah may have actually all been the ones carrying the devices that exploded around civilians. So they got the big...
So they were mostly injured and killed.
No, not necessarily.
Potentially, but they could also be mostly killed, and then there's fewer of them than there are other civilians, so you'd have more civilians injured anyways.
Okay, but that ratio would still be close, though.
Well, why would it be close?
Well, set aside the ratio, though. There's no way to know where these things detonated.
So there's one Hezbollah guy in a cafe with 30 other people, and every single one of them gets hit. That's one Hezbollah guy dead, 30 people injured.
You've seen the videos of these explosions, right? There are people very close to they're like the fruit market and in the over the counter.
Okay.
There are people really, really close to these guys when these pagers go off, and they're fine. They just stand back and they're like, "Whoa, what happened there?" They're just like scratching their heads, like an explosion just went off, like 3 feet away.
Okay. I know Lonerbox has never been near an explosion. When an explosion goes off, you're not sitting there scratching your heads. You're in fucking shock. Which, guess what, is an injury. It's not, woohoo, explosion went off. What a weird capstone to my day. It's, what the fuck just happened? Why can't I hear out of my left ear? And that's generous.
Sounds like they got lucky. Like I wouldn't go on. But hang on, no, but slow down. So are you suggesting then that the 2,000 people weren't injured? What's the relevance of them not being injured if they're close by on the camera?
I'm suggesting the people who are the 2,000 people seem to most likely be Hezbollah.
On what?
It doesn't matter. We've already established that's not sufficient upon which to kill them. They might be a civil service worker. They might be an EMS worker. Also, it doesn't matter that if you attack somebody in a legal fashion, it's still an illegal attack, irregardless of whether that person was a combatant or not. You aren't allowed to do whatever you want in the pursuit of killing enemy soldiers. You have to follow the rules.
You can see people who are next to because you can see videos of people who are next to the explosions and they are not hurt. They don't look.
But we are aware of children, for example, who have been killed by these explosives. They were not, to my knowledge, established to be holding onto these pagers and radios. They were killed by shrapnel.
The girl who was killed was holding the pager because her dad was a Hezbollah militant.
Was she?
I think it was in his room.
Has this been established? This has been proved?
Okay, this kind of goes to the point, though, that you don't know where the pager is when you detonate it. The scale of this attack is a problem. The scale of this attack means that there is no way, none whatsoever, that Israel can verify that the booby traps in question are being held by the individuals who are the intended targets.
Pretty sure it is, isn't it? Hang on.
Okay, but just to be clear, though, you're in a bit of a pickle here, because if what you're saying is what we're running with...
This is a debate tactic Sunday uses that I don't countenance with. Yes, you've activated my trap card, is not nearly the debating area that you think it is.
That indeed, people could be standing right next to these people and shrapnel just isn't a thing. It doesn't account for the majority of these kills. Then that means that the vast majority of these 2,000 people injured had to have been holding the radios or the pagers, and they were only injured?
Yeah, you've not seen the hospital footage where there are people with their hands, like where they're missing fingers, but they're not dying. They're not dead.
Sure.
Yeah, so yeah, yes.
Okay, don't do this. Disclaimer, don't do this. 4th of July recently just came and went, and most states have prohibitions against fireworks, and then places where you can buy fireworks not that far away across the border. If you go and you buy a firecracker, little teeny ass firecracker, and you you pull it out of its big string, and you light it, and you hold it into open hand, and it goes off, you'll be burned. If you close your hand around it, it will explode your goddamn hand off. This isn't a little fucking thing. This is disability, inability to work. You have maimed people. You have increased resources required to care for those people. Is it the military veterans? It depends on it depends on the military veteran, to be perfectly honest. There are a lot of people I have known in the military who are horrifying, and I don't like them and don't talk to them. And there are some people who have become incredibly compassionate from their experiences. A loner box doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, and he has been told he's wrong and is unable to accept that, and is doing a relatively human thing where he doubles down.
So you could easily be injured by it. That's why there's small explosions, or they got like flesh wounds, or yeah. Again, I don't.
The flesh wound is still like horrific, by the way, and painful and debilitating.
No, I'm just saying that if it were the case that they knew how big these explosions would be because they designed them, they're like pagers are very small. If they knew that these explosions would be so small that they would hurt the person holding the pager, but they were unlikely to hurt the people next to them, even if they were fairly close, then
you still have to guarantee or be reasonably sure that the person holding the pager is a combatant.
And I would say that's a reasonable collateral calculation.
So what you're saying though then is that these 2,000 injuries were caused by 2,000 pagers.
Well, didn't they say that's how many pagers were detonated? I don't think we know. It was like 2,000 or 3,000 pagers detonated, wasn't it?
I actually don't have that on my head. Let's see. How many? What source are you using? Can you just send me that if you have it on hand?
So a Lebanese security official said that 5,000 pagers were brought into the country. For the number that was detonated...
how many were detonated?
Where's that article? Okay. How many were detonated?
Destiny is always a detriment.
I didn't save this article, so it might take a minute to find it.
Take your time.
So are we saying that if less than 2,000 or like maybe 1,000 or 500 were detonated, that would be like a problem for Israel, right? I think we agree on that?
No. The idea is not about the number of pagers being detonated. The problem is the discrimination used in the distribution of the pagers, which is to say that Israel used absolutely zero discrimination.
Not even. What I'm saying is that if it appears to be the case that they demonstrate, let's say, no conceivable way of actually knowing where these devices were going to end up. And I think the fact that this little girl was holding the device kind of speaks to that a little bit. When they detonated, that's kind of a problem, because now this whole, they placed this on a military objective. They didn't really do that. They left them to be picked up by their military objective.
Again,
According to the AP, 12 people were killed, including 2 children. Okay, hang on. Let's hold up. Learnerbox is arguing that the vast majority of people were Hezbollah. Let's generously assume that the 10 individuals who are not children were Hezbollah. Shall we? That sounds fair. N times 100 divided by 17% of the victims. Nearly 20%. 1 in 5 is a child, and 28,000 wounded. You killed 1 in 5 children, and being generous, the other 10 are Hezbollah. Not a good ratio, my dude. That's pretty anemic, all things considered. 20% of the casualties are children. That's big. That's not little.
And this is just a legal analysis that I've read. Same thing with the objective object militant thing, right? So the legal analysis that I've read has suggested that, again, this is up to Israel. This is the onus is on them. If they either through informants or something like that knew that, the onus is on them to know that, like, they had to know that there was a reason, like there was reasonable belief that those pagers would be held by soldiers mostly when they detonated them. They can't do it perfectly. There's no perfect way to fight with Hezbollah. Because
I once again though, I'm.
Well, the argument is not the perfect way to fight with Hezbollah. Like, there's no perfect way to fight with anyone. That's not really a rational argument to be made when you're trying to argue about customary and international law. The argument is, does this specific strike meet that parameter? Not in relation to the nature of Hezbollah. The nature of Hezbollah does not abrogate your responsibility in regards to laws of armed conflict.
We are in the dark about what is the source of that certainty if they claim it, or what is the source of that confidence if they claim it. Like, obviously, it's not going to be perfect. Obviously, somebody with maybe they bombed, maybe they put booby traps in their actual guns, okay, and somebody left their gun at home, went off. That'd be one thing. Yeah. But we're talking about devices where it's like, oh, I swapped out my radio. Here, son, you take this one, or stuff like that, or stuff that you'd maybe leave around the house because it's not the kind of thing you associate with that. It's a pager or a radio. Like, I would need to see like a specific reason given for why they had confidence that these devices would only be distributed among Hamas militants or combatants, and I think combatants is kind of more important, or what? Like, because I'm just not seeing it. It seems like they intercepted this at the point of Hamas collecting them for distribution, and then not Hamas, Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah just did with it what they will. And at that point, it's like you're blind, right? Like, I don't know how on earth they would be determining where these are going to go. Or
I mean, that's the right. Sundays pretty much hit it on the head.
Whatever, because that's up to Hezbollah at that point.
But then you would also expect a lot more people to die from them as well if they're just randomly ending up in the hands of civilians, not in militants.
Well, not
I think at
necessarily.
the very least, if the militant
No, because the nature of the explosive device is such that it's unlikely to kill people.
are the ones who are closest to it, the ones who are most likely to die. And even one of the people who died had that pager because her dad gave it to her, or because she took it from her dad's place.
If they, well, you're missing the point here. If fortuitously it only killed 2,000 Hezbollah militants, and maybe that girl was even doing some jobs for them, whatever. I just plumb don't know. Let's assume that though. It doesn't matter. The point is they didn't know that. If they don't have a specific reason to know that, then maybe they got lucky, but that doesn't absolve them.
Yeah, it does. If they got lucky, it doesn't absolve them. They would have had to have some intel or some, and I'm not saying they do. That's why I'm saying this is my criticism of Israel. If in this hypothetical is that they don't have,
Okay, it's not a hypothetical. It fucking happened, first of all. Second of all, that is the criticism. Like, that's the end of the goddamn discussion. Why is this going on for another 20 minutes?
they must have had. They can't just give them the pagers and then just leave them for 5 months not knowing where they've gone, right? They would have had to have either informants or intel or some reason to believe that basically almost all these pagers are still in the hands of soldiers.
But slow down. How many pagers? 5,000?
It seems like 5,000, yeah.
Okay. How on earth do you keep track of 5,000 pagers?
It's not 5,000. It's just knowing that that those are the pagers that are still in use by the military.
Okay,
because
but each of
the
these...
reason they're using those particular pagers is obviously because they're connected to a network, right?
Okay, but each of sure. But the problem is that each of
a pager is not connected to a specific network. It's connected to a phone network.
These pagers is an individual bomb. You need to account for every single one. You need to know or have some degree of confidence and a specific reason to have that confidence that you can explain for why you're certain that that bomb ended up in the hands of a combatant and not in the hands of, say, a clerk or a kid or a hospital worker or whatever. And if you can't,
and in and you don't need to do this for I think they might be in Hezbollah hands. You have to be able to do it for every single one you're going to detonate. You have to be accountable for each one of them. That's why this attack is scary. It's indiscriminate. Definitionally, it is not precise or precision attack. It is indiscriminate.
Can't do that, or if you don't for whatever reason, I don't even know why we're entertaining the idea that they'd have an explanation. The onus is on them to provide that explanation.
Yeah, but that's because you are with, I think, no evidence or no reason to believe that for some reason the death ratio is incredibly strong in Israel's favor, whereas
it's actually
we're just
completely.
It's not.
I don't care about that at all.
20% kids is not strong in Israel's favor.
Morally, I do. I care about the people who were harmed if they were civilians. But let's assume that they're all militants, every single one. If Israel didn't have a specific reason to know that those would end up in the hands of militants, it doesn't matter. They just got lucky. They got lucky they didn't commit a catastrophic war crime. I don't think they did. I think that's a little sanguine.
Yeah, so if they had an informant who just said, they're still using these pagers, the units are still using these pagers, there's no unit that's just...
No, not sufficient.
Ditch the pagers, then is that not a reason to believe that they'd be in the hands of militants?
No, because the use of the pagers by itself doesn't tell you where the pagers are. Who specifically is exclusively making use of the pagers, for example, where the pagers are being stored, all sorts of things. We don't know, even if they're literally in their hands at the time they all went off. Once again, a child had one, right?
Yeah,
how long did the child have it in her hands?
I don't know. I think the message went for 10 seconds and then they blew up. So I think what might have happened is that it went off. The dad told the child to go get the pager, and then. Okay,
see, that's a problem, because that can happen in a lot of ways.
Wait.
Right?
I need you to acknowledge one thing for me. Okay. Given how Hezbollah fights, is there any way to target Hezbollah without hurting civilians? Given how they fight.
Yes. Yes, I will fight you on this, Cylinder Box.
I'm in the dark about that, but that's immaterial.
The fact that it's not immaterial.
It's completely immaterial.
The question is not if you
because unfortunately, unfortunately, the nature.
Come on,
but the nature. But the nature of international law is not that you're. The nature of international law is not that you're off the hook if it would be very, very difficult to not follow it, right? Obviously, the cost of
Yes, yes, you are 100% correct.
Cost of abiding by ethical standards is disadvantage. Otherwise, everybody would do it.
No, the international law is that if you are a militant and you are around civilians, because again, with Hezbollah, they are a non-state army, which means they assume a continuous.
Oh, no.
combat
I agree with
they
you.
They are always targetable.
Oh, I agree with you.
No, they're not. You cannot still murder civilians willy-nilly to kill Hezbollah militants.
No. Let's run with that. Let's run. I'm going to assume that I won that argument, quote unquote, and military objective includes military personnel. Okay, you still have the problem though of Israel did not know or has provided, rather, let's be modest, has provided no reason to think that they had confidence or grounds for confidence that those devices would be specifically in the hands of their military objectives at the time they went off. And
they had reason to believe that most of them would be, yeah.
That's not sufficient. They guessed. They don't have any reason to believe.
Said that. They haven't provided a reason,
No,
though.
the IRGC said that.
Sonobox know that even if a soldier kills somebody outside of a normal parameter, it's still murder? Probably not.
The IRGC.
I gave that example today in the cathedral, by the way, of someone being court-martialed for murder.
Said that those pagers were being used by Hezbollah, not by civilians.
Well, they're being used by Hezbollah, not by they're being used by operatives, not by civilians. I'm still very curious as to how they determine this. I haven't seen the justification for this assumption, but let's run with that. They're being used. Well, what does used mean? Does used mean that they're deployed officially for the purposes of use by these departments, or does that mean they are exclusively handled by these personnel? Because those are two different things. And if you're not able to keep track of those, if these, for example, have been circulating, as it appears to be the case, for months, they could have gone to any number of hands. Like, I just...
But I've already said that, though. I've already said that if they just handed them over and then 5 months later they blew them up with no knowledge of whether or not they were still in use, that would be a crime. Yeah.
How about partial knowledge and assumptions? Maybe assumptions on the basis of maybe not particularly compelling evidence. Like, let's say, for example, people check in on these pagers and they assume, because they check in on these pagers periodically, that these pagers are therefore being handled by the appropriate targets and are not, for example, sitting on kitchen counters and locker rooms, etc., in the meantime between those things.
Well, it's just that they're in the hands of the units. Like,
You don't know that. You haven't established that fact. You can't just sit there while they're in the hands of the units. You haven't established that fact.
Literally weren't, though.
That's like,
unless you physically have eyes on the unit, members of the unit, and see them holding the pagers, you have not established that fact.
But they literally weren't in the hands of the units. They were literally in the hands of other people, which is why a little girl was killed by them. That's just one example. The point is, at no point,
whenever you invoke the civilian deaths, of which there were 3 out of 40, you're comparing it to a perfect scenario. There is no perfect scenario. There's no way to fight Hezbollah without.
No, we're not. We're not comparing it to a perfect scenario. We're comparing it to the scenario that occurred.
Doesn't matter. Right? That really doesn't matter. You keep bringing up the. It
does matter, because if they used Hellfires, this might have killed more or injured more civilians.
Yes, and then it.
But then they would still be wrong for using the Hellfires. Okay. This is going in circles. I don't want to take up too much of your time tonight. We'll be back on Sunday. It'll be fun. Thank you all. Have a good night.
dance, 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 dance like a monkey. Move, 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 move like a monkey. Shoot, 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 shoot like a monkey. Kill, 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 kill like a monkey. Dance, 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 dance like a monkey. Move, 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 move like a monkey. Shoot, 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 shoot like a monkey. Kill, 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 kill like a monkey.